We called them fallen angels. They were strung up by their ankles and suspended from trees. There was always barbed wire, wrapped all around the body, sliced the skin and ripped the tissue. And it was worse if they struggled. Ideally, they would die of dehydration, but this mercy was extended to only a very fortunate few. Most of the time, they would dangle from the branches for hours, as the barbs tore their flesh and the pressure built in their heads. When upright, the heart doesn't have to pump blood that hard to circulate through the brain. Gravity does most of the work to get it back down. Consequently, the blood vessels up there are smaller and thinner than the rest of the body. I'd rather be hung, personally. I would much prefer the struggle for breathing and kicking the air as the white-hot agony of my vertebrae coming apart, then waiting for the blood to pool in my head, clot, and eventually burst the veins and feel the warm, sticky liquid drip out of my eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. A noose would be a kinder and sufficient, gentler. "There's something in here," my brother would tell me from the porch, pointing a cigarette toward the trees. "It watches people, then strings up the ones it doesn't like." As paranoid as he was, I agreed with him. He spent a lot of time on that porch. I don't let him smoke in the house. He sat out there, cigarette in one hand, gun in the other, just watching the woods and waiting for something to come out. One night, I heard him yelling frantically, trying to get my attention. Gunshot after gunshot exploded through the air and intermingled with his crazed screaming. I ran out onto the porch to find my brother in a panic, slowly turning to rage. "Guns don't do anything. I saw them. Their eyes, they were peering out from the trees, just watching me. They almost glowed." He empathetically pointed toward the woods behind our house, trying to show me the eyes that weren't there. There's no reason to wake up the whole neighborhood. My brother had this habit of keeping a cigarette between his teeth when he talked. It didn't matter how important what he said was. I could only see the glowing end of the cigarette bobbing up and down as the words fell out. It was infuriating, and one of those trivial things that find its way to crawl under your skin and stays there, tapping at the inside of your skull. I had expressed my displeasure several times, but he didn't seem to care much. I must have been giving him a look this time because he yanked the cigarette out of his mouth and let it dangle in his fingers. "I will not be strung up in those woods." He spit his final words at me before stomping out, remaining a half cigarette and storming inside. I wasn't worried that the neighbors would call the police. They knew my brother, and they knew the woods. It was amazing, the things you could get away with in this town. Everybody was afraid, but more than that, they were constantly on edge, as if their whole body seethed with anticipation. The paranoia that was so ingrained into these people could only be born out of desperation. It was seeming as they tried everything. Guns, knives, brute force. Heck, one time someone tried to light the whole forest on fire. The kids played in the street, or preferably if they had friends from the next subdivision, in the backyards of the next door neighbors. When they grabbed their flashlights in the middle of the night, they would tell stories about the woods. They never talked about Bloody Mary or Slenderman because in Fadell, the real horror lived about 10 feet behind their homes. I don't think anyone in that town had seen the creature in the woods, but we all knew what they looked like. The descriptions were spreading in passing whispers and hushed voices out of fear that they were listening. All the children spoke softly but empathetically about their gray-skinned 6-inch fingers and hollow, infinite sockets carved deep into their skulls. They seemed almost human, and maybe at one time they were. Once that I can remember, a kid went into the forest. A bunch of others dared him to, and they waited in the shadows between houses, hearts pounding even though they weren't the ones going in. In silence, they watched him glance back, hoping they would call the whole thing off, and reluctantly, he submerged himself into the trees. There was snapping of twigs and then abruptly stillness. The group did not take their eyes off the woods, yet they could see the fear among their friends. They waited for a minute, surprisingly, before cautiously taking a few steps backward, then turning and sprinting away. The boy was gone. The next day, a group of police officers, most of whom reassigned that same day, were sent in after him. Let me tell you, he struggled. The wire tore through his skin of his abdomen, leaving his internal organs to spill out and hang from his body. After that day, no children went into the woods. They didn't even have to be told not to. After the paper ran that story, Fadell lost his mind. Sure, bodies turned up every other week, but it was never a child. The kind of death was somehow more than murder. It was a disaster, a tragedy. I lived right on the edge of the woods, and that incident stuck with me. I somehow made the whole thing real. These things were here, right behind my house. My last night in Fadell was hopefully the last, the worst night of my life there. My brother was outside smoking, and I was on the couch, mostly asleep. I'm not a heavy sleeper, so I was glad when the small noises around me seemed to quiet down, but just as I was about to drift off, my brother fired that gun about 3,000 times, ran inside, slammed the door behind him, cigarette still lit, clamped fiercely between his teeth. I shot up, dazed and unsure of what was happening. Hands trembling, my brother ran to all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. What the heck, man? I rubbed my eyes, wishing I was asleep. He sat on the coffee table, inches away from me, voice raspy and frightened. I saw them. They came out. His eyes were crazed as his mouth was running faster than his head. He inadvertently blew smoke from his lips with every rushed word and forced breath. I didn't even know you could see them. My mouth opened before I could speak. I heard something tapping on the sliding glass door. My jaw hung ajar, and my brother and I froze instinctively. It was too soft of a knock, but too hard to be the wind. A moment later, it came again. They're coming to get me, my brother whispered. His eyes were wild, darting across the room as if he was afraid to leave them in one place for too long. They don't like me. Are you sure you saw them? My voice was barely audible somehow. I knew that they could hear me anyway. I first noticed them in the corner of my eye, just one at first, but then more came. Tall. My God, they were tall. Until they started moving, I thought they were trees. Their arms hang at their sides and are as gangly as branches. What gave them away was the skin. Looked just like ash. While the sounds did not increase in volume, they came in new places, and I heard them still from the door, but they were also at the windows, sides of the house, and most disturbingly, the roof. They don't have faces. I mean, they've got eyes, but not really. They just got these holes. My brother made circles with his pointer finger and thumb and held them over his own eyes. And the holes got this black stuff coming out of them, just dripping down their heads. I think they could have been human if they wanted to be. More tapping ensued. My palms were clammy and I broke out in a cold sweat. I could picture their long, bony fingers rapping on the house. Their knot eyes inches from the window, waiting for us to draw back the curtain and meet their gaze. Until that moment, I don't think I've ever been truly afraid. The tapping, it echoed all around us. We knew we couldn't leave. And even if we called someone, what good would it do? I don't think anything could have saved us. Our only option was to wait and hope that we'd not receive a death sentence. More tapping. I now could hear it coming from beneath the house. These things were everywhere. It scared me that They didn't just burst in, they were waiting, and it scared me more that I didn't know what. I couldn't do anything but wait. This isn't how I wanted to die. My brother and I sat on the floor between the couch and the coffee table, and I just hoped it would end. "What do you think they are?" I asked. We all heard the stories, but these creatures had no name. They simply existed. They were always here, and we did everything we could to leave them alone, to live without them, and for the most part they let us, but they took some people, I suppose, to make an example. It was a constant reminder of fear that maybe kept this town in line. My brother's head bowed. His eyes would not meet mine. He lit his fourth cigarette of the night, took a long drag and holding it deep in his lungs before releasing. With his eyes fixed at that door, he said the only words that have ever stuck real fear into my core. "Jimmy, I think they're God." I could only hear the tapping and feel them staring into me from all directions. Despite the emptiness of the house, we knew they were in some way both inside and outside. I forced my eyes shut, and in the darkness, I was only able to picture their elongated limbs hanging at their sides, their shoulders hunched to fit under our low ceilings. God, I could feel the inky ooze dripping into my hair. I refused to open my eyes because if I did, they would have been there. If they remained closed, it was easier to pretend. My brother promised me that he would stay awake all night. He swore. Grabbing a pillow from the couch, he handed it to me and insisted that I slept. I argued, but I was so tired eventually I did fall asleep, albeit against my will. It had to be noon when I awoke. I was alone. I checked the whole house and even mustered up the courage to step onto the porch. But I was alone. Dead or alive, I had to find my brother. He went into the woods. I think that was the biggest mess up of my entire life. After a deep breath, I stepped into the tree line. The sun was in high noon after the sky, but it was impossibly dark inside that forest and even more unbelievably silent. I was the only thing that disturbed the stillness. I'll be honest here and say I didn't have a plan. I had no idea where to look for my brother, and I didn't know how I would react if I found him in the branches. When I stopped in a small clearing to look around, the blurs in the corner of my vision began to move. I knew what it was. I froze, and I think that even my heart stopped beating. Maybe they wouldn't see me, maybe they'd leave. Maybe I was just losing my mind. They got closer to me, close enough to see. If they didn't move, they could be the trees, but if they did, they were something that shouldn't have been allowed to exist. I shut my eyes and ran blindly through the forest, running into trees, scraping my arms on low-hanging branches, and miraculously, I made it out. I didn't stop running until I threw myself in my car. I sped down the highway and checked into a motel. Though it took me an extra hour to fall asleep that night, I kept the TV turned up, just in case that they came tapping. I never saw my brother or Fadell again. I'm no genius, but I knew when to get out of that town. I moved to a new state, this time making sure that I lived in a city away from woods. Even though the years and miles have passed since that night, every so often I hear that tapping again, with the knowledge that I can never escape my hometown. I am left with nothing else to do but wait until it's my turn, and I hope I dehydrate. Hello everybody, Ark here. I would just like to thank you all so much for watching this video, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed it and maybe it sent some chills down your spine. This story was submitted to me by Braz's McCarhu. I hope I didn't butcher your name. But yeah, he's the one who sent the story in. He's not the author, but they did send me a link to it. I'm not sure who the real author is, but if you wrote the story, you know who you are. I don't take any credit for this story. However, I thought it was too good not to share. These kinds of stories are awesome. If you have any of your own, or if you know any, please send them in my email. It should be in the description below and in this final title picture. So again, guys, I hope you like and subscribe if you want to see more videos, and have a great day.